Welcome to Muffin Talk.
Kia ora and welcome to Muffin Talk. This program is brought to you by the initiative Titipounamu, Study and Joy. I am pleased to welcome back today Professor Thomas O'Loughlin, who is joining us from the United Kingdom. Thomas O'Loughlin is originally from Dublin, Ireland. He is an ordained priest and emeritus professor of historical theology at the University of Nottingham. Tom, thank you very much for joining us today from the United Kingdom. Welcome to Muffin Talk again.
Thank you.
We are currently in the season of Lent, which is often described as the time of preparation. In many parishes, there are people being prepared for baptism on Easter, on the Easter Vigil usually. What is the connection between Lent and baptism?
In the early churches, people went through a series of stages before they were baptized. So it was very different to the way I was baptized, for instance, when I was 10 days old. And most Catholics, they only see children being baptized. But in the early churches, what happened was people spent months, perhaps years, absorbing the story of the Christians and seeing the Christian story as their story. And then they had a period of intense preparation before the actual baptism itself. And that preparation was seen to be like the preparation of Jesus for his public ministry. So as Jesus spent 40 days in the desert before his public ministry, so the person to be baptized, before they enter baptism and the ministry of being a Christian, they should go through a similar desert experience. And that's how the period of 40 days, it was to be of prayer. They were supposed to listen to further instructions. They were to begin the ritual of being baptized. So they were to be anointed. They were to renounce the devil. They were to formally recite the Lord's Prayer. So the 40 days was seen as leading up to the final great moment, which is the actual act of baptism, which took place on the Easter Vigil. And of course, baptism, because it was seen as an act of the community, required that not only the person who was to be baptized fasted as a preparation, but the community fasted with the person so that they would support that person going through this. Just Jesus was tempted in the desert. It was seen as a risky time. And one of the ways you supported this person who was about to go through initiation was you fasted with them. So it became a period of community fasting. Then, of course, in the 4th century, baptism becomes just the ticket you have, because everyone is increasingly, the nice people in society are all baptized. And then infant baptism becomes the norm. So we kept the fasting. And then you've kept the fasting. The baptisms are not taking place on Easter Saturday night. Oh, well, we're doing this just as penitence. And so it moves from the period of preparing for baptism to sort of spring cleaning and a sort of an annual brush up.
When you say about the community being together during that process and the baptism, that means that That's why you have many children being baptized at the same time and also adults being baptized then for Easter
Well,
night.
that is, of course, many baptisms at Easter and adults being baptized is something that has only re-emerged in the church since the Second Vatican Council. As late as 1970, I remember a parish priest saying there will be no baptisms on Easter Sunday because the clergy in his parish had done enough work over Easter, and so the baptisms would be delayed for a further week. Now, can you imagine saying that today? But he was still thinking in terms of the defective liturgy that Vatican II had to try and sort out, where you just you do baptisms. They literally took 5 minutes, and they were done at the end of the last mass on a Sunday morning. There wasn't that sense of, even though we're baptizing children, we must try to see this as part of the initiation into the church.
So there shouldn't really be a single baptism on a day when nobody else is in church.
Well, baptism is a community activity because it's not just the individual who is being baptized, but it is the community welcoming a new member. And you are not just getting some sort of free entry ticket. You're actually becoming a member of the people of God. And so the people of God, it should be a community celebration. And just as preparation requires the community, baptism requires the community. And that's why baptisms are best done on the great feasts, and are best done in the context of a community celebration, which is very often the Eucharist.
Yeah. And in older churches, the baptismal font is placed somewhere at the entrance of the churches usually. But then there are some churches where the baptismal font is in the front or even only visible during the baptism ceremony. Where would be the best location for a baptismal font in a church?
Well, let's think the churches we have in this country and in New Zealand all follow a 19th century model. And they're not very good examples, but just imagine you were in Florence in Italy, or you were in Milan. In both places, you have the great cathedral. And then outside of the cathedral, in a separate building, you have the baptistry. If you think of older churches in Germany, and I mean churches that go back several hundred years, the baptistry was often built on as a side building. And the reason for that is that essentially the shape of our churches is for dealing with the Eucharist, which means they're built around a table. But baptism is built around a font. And so ideally you have two separate and distinct spaces. Now, in the reconstructed Catholic churches in Britain and in the churches in New Zealand, which followed them, that sort of level of investment was not possible. Everything was done together. If there was a little baptistry, it was a sort of a little box pushed down at one side. So to try and find the best place to put the baptismal font, well, one way to do it is to put it near the door. And then it reminds people that you enter the church through passing through the baptismal font. In some places, it's put very close to the Eucharistic table, what's often referred to inaccurately as the altar. That is not a very good solution because it's confusing two spaces. a table is to gather around. A font is ideally a place where a person can enter in, be buried, and can rise again. The imagery is all taken from Romans chapter 6. But people want to be able to see the baptism. They have only one space. You don't want it to clutter the space around the table, yet you do want it to be in the center of the only single space the community has. So one way to do it is to put the table at one end of a rectangle and the font at the other end of a rectangle, and then you don't let them get cluttered. You have an economical use of space and everyone can see. But this is not an ideal solution. In an ideal world, we would have the Eucharistic space and we'd have another space, which is the baptismal space. And indeed, in the very earliest church building that we have, where a church was specifically built from the ground up, the church in Dura Europos in Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq, in that there were two completely separate spaces. But that's just too expensive. So if you look at the picture of the church in Bulimba, which is just outside Brisbane, you will see a parish priest there. He was trying to figure out, how do I keep the table central? How do I put the font so that people will see it as coming into the church? They can see a baptism, but it's not cluttering. And what he did was he put them in a line and put the seats either side. So if you look at that picture, you will see as good a practical solution as you can come up.
And to keep it whilst in one space.
Yes, because let's face it, if a parish priest said, oh, we'll have the baptism in the parish hall, you'd say, oh, no, we want it in the church. But the ideal, the baptistry was originally a separate space. And that's why if you go to a place like Florence or Milan, the baptistry is a completely separate building.
Yeah. And I know it from many churches where it's in the entrance and it's not used anymore for practical reasons in older churches in Germany, for example. But then you have the holy water in it. So you are passing by and you're taking holy water from the baptismal font, which is another symbol.
Well, that's the origin of having holy water at the gate, at the door of the church. It was because the font was there and the font was left full of water. And so people took the water.
So originally they were baptized there in the same place where people...
and then the fonts get smaller and smaller and smaller until finally they end up as just tiny little basins.
But the Vatican II also brought the immerse baptismal font. Some churches have big fonts.
Yes, I know 3 Catholic churches which have immersion fonts. But in one of them, the parish priest is terrified to use it. And in the other 2, it's offered to people, but people are so scared, they only use it very occasionally. Immersion is one of those things that belongs to our history, but is far too scary for most people. It's hard enough to get people to realize that baptism is not some sort of magic for children, that it is a public declaration of one's own willingness to die and rise with Christ in the midst of the community. And if you can get people to feel that community sense, that's often hard enough. There's a communication problem. I was looking at the immersion font in this church some years ago, and I said to the parish priest, how often is it used? And he said, we only fill it now on Easter Saturday night. And sometimes it's used and sometimes it's not. But he says it certainly makes preaching about dying and rising much easier.
Yeah.
And he invites everyone to walk up to this big immersion thing and to take, when they're renewing their baptismal vows, instead of him going around and sprinkling them, he invites everyone to go up and to take water in their hands and sprinkle it on their face. Curiously, we are aware that people will say, on the one hand, our liturgy is just so boring and, it's just words. And yet, when we actually use the great symbols of water and dying and rising, say, oh, that's a bit too much for me. So we have a very strange attitude, and it hasn't been helped by the fact that the catechesis of Vatican II has often been very poor, in that everything is explained. Oh, well, we're just doing it this way so that you can see. It's far more complicated.
Thank you so much for this insight and for connecting baptism to Lent or Lent to baptism. I think that's really worthwhile thinking about, and thinking also about when is the good time to have the baptism, so that the community can really participate and be reminded of their own baptism. Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
In the bonds of love we meet, for the world a new day dawning and shining.